Good morning, everyone. My name is Heather Hopkins. I'm the founder and managing director of NextWealth. We are a research and consulting firm. Welcome to our webinar on platform e-signatures and approaches to document submission. Who would have thought that this was such a hot topic that we'd have, I think there's like 80 something people registered for the webinar. So thanks for joining us today. The purpose of this webinar and the work we've done is to benchmark platform approaches to document submission and e-signatures. We recognize that the way that you submit documents to your platform won't be the deciding factor for which platform that you use, but it can be a source of frustration for advisors. And certainly if you look at social media, you'll hear some rants about it. So we think that the report that we've produced should be helpful to advisors to nudge their platform to do more in areas where they might be lagging behind other players in the industry. We also want to recognize that platforms have done a huge amount of work in the past few weeks to facilitate business activity in lockdown. I mean, I'm not sure that it's been highlighted enough. In my view, it hasn't been highlighted enough, but we had high trading volumes, a huge amount of volume coming into platforms at the same time that people were suddenly working remotely, and largely things continued as they should. You know, there's been some niggles with call centers not being available, but clients have still been able to access their money, and business has been able to proceed. So we think that's really encouraging, and that, you know, that deserves recognition. But it doesn't mean that there's not more to be done, of course. And so the work that my colleague Hannah did, as she led on this research, was to look across a large number of processes across platforms to see how firms accept different processes, and she'll share the findings from that. And what we want to do today is facilitate a conversation about document submission and e-signatures on our research, but also wider as well. The agenda, which I think is on the screen now, is actually, Hannah, do you mind switching to me? Because it's a bit weird just to look at a screen, and then you can look at Rich in a minute. But the agenda is, we'll come to Rich Ellis, financial planner with Ellis, Davies. This research that we did actually kicked off from an interchange that I had with Rich on Twitter. And so we asked him if he'd come today just to share why this issue is important to him as a financial planner. And then I'll pass to Hannah Wemyss, a research associate with NextWealth, who led on this research. Who'll go through some of the findings. And then Phil Young from Zero Support will talk about some of his thinking around e-signatures. And you might have seen an article he wrote in Money Marketing, which triggered me to ask him to join the webinar, because some really interesting views about why e-signatures might not be the solution advisors I thought they would be. We're hoping to wrap up the sort of quote unquote formal part of the agenda in the next sort of 25 to 30 minutes. So we have lots of time for questions. In terms of housekeeping, we're recording the webinar. So if there's a question you don't want your name associated with, if you can just put it through chat privately to me, I can ask it for you. There's a facility to raise your hand if you have a question. If you put the question through chat, then I can consolidate a few together and ask them, or I can come to you so you can ask the question once we get through the sort of formal bit. So that's it from me. I'm now going to pass to you, Rich, if that's okay.
Great, thanks for that, Heather. So briefly, sort of 5 minutes on my sort of view of things for everyone, which hopefully might be a bit useful. So this kind of area is something that's very pertinent to us. We're only a 3-year-old financial planning business, and we, by design from the ground up, we want to do things very efficiently, be as paper-free as possible, although that's something that's extremely challenging, and be really efficient with our clients in order to drive the operational costs and servicing costs of our business down, that we obviously pass on to them through advice fees. So the issue at the moment is, I look at it as 2 things. You've got the advice part of the equation, and typically it can often be up to 100 pieces of paper that we're asking clients to read if you take into account suitability reports, KID documents, fact sheets, key features, most of which we're now obviously uploading to portals or sending via secure mail, but we're still fundamentally asking a client to read these and refer to these before any advice is implemented. We then move on to the implementation phase, and we've got a raft of application forms that are required. For most part, which the research will show, wet signatures are required on a lot of those pieces of documentation. I did jot down prior to this morning's session that I'm reminded of a client that this is a UK platform that I won't name, but we had 32 pages of application forms for a couple, and 18 wet signatures were required in order to implement the advice. So that is fundamentally going, regardless of lockdown, not being able to physically see clients, that's still a bit of a task, and it's somewhat embarrassing when a lot of our clients are sending us documents that are signed by DocuSign, and we either have to say if they're internal documents, yes or no, our internal compliance team won't allow this because we're part of a network, or if those letters of authority or application forms that are signed electronically are not acceptable by the platform, we kind of almost have to go back and get them to sign them and send them in the post to us. So it's just a bit of a from our perspective, it's just blocking us from being efficient, and it's frustrating and not operationally ideal when a lot of platforms will accept scanned signatures for some processes, not for others, and different processes for different parts of the process. So yeah, it's frustrating, and it's not allowing us to be as efficient as we want to. Interestingly, just to finish off, there's a blog or a question on a blog on money marketing that actually went live on Tuesday, and the question was, should providers and platforms be forced to accept digital signatures? And as of this morning, 83% of 125 respondents said yes. Forced meaning regulator, I'm assuming. I'm not quite sure, but that was very interesting feedback from that. 6% were unsure and 11% said no. So it's something that's everyone's talking about at the moment, clearly.
Great, thank you, Rich. I think that point that often gets forgotten is that financial advisors or financial planners, whatever term you use, are a professional services organization, really, right? You're offering professional service to your clients increasingly. That's certainly the direction of travel, and most of the people I talk to, that's what they're trying to do. And they're relying on product providers to help them to deliver that service to their clients. And sometimes that's where the customer experience falls apart a bit, and advisors find themselves apologizing for the practices and as sort of the representation of the industry. So thanks for those comments, and consistent with what we're hearing elsewhere. Hannah, can I pass to you to share some of the results from the work that you did?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just going to pop us back on the presentation just so you can see. So it's very similar to what Rich has just spoke about, is exactly why we wanted to do this research. It's very clear that for financial advisors, they've been complaining for a while that there's an excess of forms and wet signatures required by both platforms and providers as well. And this research was really so we could try and pinpoint where these frictions might lie and see where we can probably make those improvements. Additionally, by reducing the strain on advisors and the masses of paperwork they're having to do, which Rich has just demonstrated, by reducing that, we could help to increase the access to advice by freeing up both financial advisors' time and power planners, and even for support staff. So it is a firm-wide change that it would help for advice firms, which is really, really important. In light of COVID, platforms have moved far and fast to make these changes, and they've started to accept scanned documentation. just to ensure that business can be facilitated despite all the social distancing. And there will be in cases where this might not still be, this might not actually be happening. And as Rich said, it's very difficult to get people to have wet signatures when you're very far away from them now and you can't travel to see clients. I do think this is a time where we're ready for this change. It has been coming to a peak for many years now, especially recently. There's been little movement. However, I think the pandemic's really given platforms that nudge to take the step forward and actually make these changes and implement them. So before I go on to the findings, I'm just going to give a bit more detail about how we actually collected the data and what it looked like. We spoke to 21 different platforms across the industry, and we chose 85 distinct processes across the financial planning journey for a client, just to try and create a holistic view of where these frictions may come up. Additionally, the idea of the research was to offer a comprehensive picture of the documentation submission requirements across our industry. We do have a full process by process breakdown, so if you are interested, obviously speak to myself or Heather. It is available to purchase. With the research, we really wanted to break it down further to distinguish whether it's the submission method or if it's the signature that's the issue. So we looked into the document submission. Do you have to send it in via the post, or are you sending it as an online journey? And we then looked specifically at what signatures are accepted. So do we actually have to get a physical pen out and have a wet signature, or are we able to have no signature at all and it's all done on a platform or via an email and instructed email? And so looking at the first section we looked at, which was our documentation submission, some really interesting points started to come out. We saw a lot of common methods across a few of our different processes. We also saw areas where this differed. For most platforms, they allow advisors to update charges, to set up or change their income drawdown, to set up regular withdrawals, and also to manage their portfolios all online. So this won't require a signature. It could be done on a platform. It could also be instructed through an email. Whatever it is, it's on a computer and it's paper free. These processes would be conducted more frequently, and we are starting to move away from requiring a form altogether for these, which is a really positive to see in the research that this was getting pulled out. There is steps and there's processes taking this on. Additionally, we did see a lot of common areas where scanned documentation is required. Typically, it's needed for setting up power of attorney, to provide different certificates, if it's your birth, your marriage, or your death certificates, and also filling out forms like your ill health forms, or providing the notification of beneficiaries. These are processes that may not be required at a great speed, and therefore the friction has been kept to quite a minimum if the scan processes stayed in place. We know it's unlikely for the certificates to change, as they are legal documentation, they're certified documents. However, we would expect the other forms could start to make that movement at least towards an e-signature or further into an online journey. What we found most interesting, though, was these points where there's differences, and maybe why there's differences within the industry across different processes. One of the clear processes that this came out on was the cancellation notice. Some platforms still require paper. A large group have also shifted to scanned documentation. However, there are some platforms that have allowed this to happen online, completely electronically, or with an e-signature. The same comes with withdrawal requests if it's full or partial, and also with the amendment of details. These are obviously quite serious movements within an account, so it is important that it's verified properly, and that could be why we're seeing a lot of people keeping the paper with a wet signature. But we hope we can start making a bit more of a consensus across the industry. Secondly, we looked into the signature requirements. So we broke this down to look at whether a document or a form might need no signature at all, and whether an electronic signature is required, whether it's a scanned document with a wet signature, or if it's a paper signature, again, obviously a wet signature. And you should note that some of these percentages won't add up to 100. And it's not because we're not missing any of the data, it's entirely because for some platforms, the processes just don't apply. They don't have a process for that. As you can see by looking at the data on the table now, and specifically the bottom line of each of these tables, there's more than half of platforms still require paper copies for at least one of their processes. These processes are usually dealing with orphan customers, so identifying an ID or identifying their bank ID. It's also when you're setting up a trust or making amendments to a trust agreement, or of course if you to receive the grant of probate or a death certificate. Again, like I've mentioned before, it is a legal document. It's likely not to change, but it's good to note that they probably would stay there, or hopefully we can change those around it. Looking at the opposite side of the scale, so we're looking at where there's no signatures, it's an online journey, it's super easy, we don't need to bother the client with a wet signature. There are processes that can be completed online. So for Aegon, both Aegon platforms actually, and True Potential, over 3/4 of their processes are online. So it is achievable, which is a really positive thing to see. Additionally, for Embark, Fidelity and P1 platform, they're looking at over half and starting to push further up with those no signatures, which again is really good to see. We do expect to see more platforms switch to these digital processes and start to really reduce any paperwork or forms that are required. Lastly, what is interesting, because I know Rich, you've just mentioned about electronic signatures, again, we've seen that electronic signatures are not adapted on the whole. We are looking again at half of platforms not adapting it at all. In recent weeks, there has been discussion about whether an e-signature is even accepted by the FCA. They have come out and commented and said that when they've said a signature, it doesn't entirely mean a wet ink signature, but e-signatures still comes under a matter of law. So it goes back to the legal and compliance issues. So this could be why we're seeing not a widespread of adoption of e-signatures, but something we'll hopefully get over in the future with improved security, etc. So,
can I just ask a question on this, because we've had a question come through. It's probably worth clarifying about Transact, because what we're reporting for Transact might be different from what advisors are experiencing. Do you want to clarify that for us?
So we spoke to Transact because we had a lot of financial advisors speaking to us saying this is crazy. So we really want to look in and see what the truth is about what's going on. They are about to release an upload, and so it will be coming in the next few weeks. When we spoke to Transact, it did seem unfair to write that it was all paper when you could, in theory, keep a hold of any paperwork you have at the moment and upload it when this release comes out. I do believe that's about to get shared with you all at the end of this week or beginning of next week. So we just wanted to make sure that obviously this data isn't just valid for the next few days, but you can come back to this in a week's time and see where it compares. They are making that change, which is fantastic. It is one of the ones that have really made
the other thing on that is it seemed unfair to say a paper signature was required, because they said that no advisor had to send in the paper form. So if you are using Transact, you don't have to send in the form by mail. You can just hang on to it. And when they launch their online portal, which is meant to be in the next week or two, so we had quite a bit of back and forth with them, and we agreed that a paper signature wasn't required. But it hadn't been communicated yet. So so they said they were giving us a scoop. So there you go. It was worth your time today for using Transact, hopefully.
Definitely. So other than looking at our documentation and our signatures, we also want to take a delve into where maybe electronic or automated processes are implemented in other parts of the financial planning process, just to compare it and see if it's just the documentation that's really getting held back. So in addition to looking at these forms, we also looked at the different payment methods. We've seen on whole all platforms accept backs. Nobody says, well, all platforms within our research say you can accept backs. Nobody says that they have to have a check. Checks are still accepted. We have found that actually the reason for this is entirely up to the banks. It's because of limits. So if somebody wants to move over more money than they can within a backs transfer, they would probably prefer to go with a check, or you're going to have to go back day after day to create the full amount. So there is only so much obviously a platform can do at that point when it's in the hands of the bank's limits. But it's really good to see that acceptance has come over. We've also seen that with withdrawals, there is a skew towards backs. So we know that platforms are trying hard to get it completely paperless and get rid of the checks. But I don't think that'll be completely removed, because we did speak to one financial advisor a couple of weeks back who said it's actually for ease of the client. They might prefer to do a check than use their backs online, and it's all about service in the end. So keeping it open as an option, I think will continue. We won't entirely go electronic with that, which I think is very important. So just to conclude what we've spoken about, there is a movement towards online journeys. It is apparent. I've spoken to many platforms over the few weeks through this research, and they know they want to make the changes. It can just be a bit of a struggle. You are fighting with technology at this point to make sure that it's up and moving and everything is secure. There is a clear movement due to COVID-19. It's not a great situation we're in, but it has given the industry a little bit of a nudge, which we need, and it's taken us a little bit further on this journey. Platforms are continuing to make these changes as we speak, and we've just spoken about Transact. They're going through their changes right now, and there's many others that are implementing, at least for some more of their processes. So it's just the technology that's required. As much as it's a transformation for the processes, many platforms are willing to make changes, and the pressure they've received from advisors during this time has definitely encouraged the movement. The industry has rose to the coronavirus challenge, and I really hope we can keep up this momentum to offer a real frictionless and a modern journey for both the customers and our financial advisors.
Great, thank you, Hannah. There's a few questions, but we'll come to them afterwards. Oh, actually, Rich, you've got your hand up, and as a panelist, I think you can butt in. Go ahead.
I just wanted to add my 2 pence worth before the questions start. It's interesting because I think there's a lot of rhetoric and a lot of noise coming out of platforms in the main that we've heard a lot of directly around what they intend to do, and the platform that we've already talked about. It starts with a T and ends with a T. Have been saying that for 5 or 6 years, that they're going to start getting rid of forms. So there's one thing about what's being said and one thing that's what they truly mean. And if I was in charge of a platform and I'm seeing AUM going up on the platform and I'm seeing consistent 5-star service awards, I'm probably thinking, actually, life's good. We don't need to worry about this too much. Is it really an issue? So I think, what can we do? And I think one idea is to get platform ratings agencies and third-party providers to put this subject in the customer service box. Because I think if platforms start losing their 5-star service awards because they're not making it efficient for their customers, which are financial advisors predominantly, then I think that that should hurt a little bit. That's just my view.
Absolutely.
Definitely. So if this is an issue that you're passionate about, you should definitely go to the NextWealth directory and rate your platform. Shameless plug for the NextWealth directory. But I agree. It should be considered part of client servicing, because it is. Phil, can I come to you?
You can. I guess you've already sort of referenced the article that I did a few weeks ago that's on money marketing, so you can sort of people can read that. I'll try and avoid regurgitating the whole thing again. I should explain it. Sort of the background in terms of why I've kind of been looking into it of late is we did. There's a project that we did at Sense Network, which is one of the businesses that I chair, where I kind of said I really don't like pens and biros and things like that. Let's just ban them all and see if we can get rid of them. what I found, which I was surprised at, was that there was no requirement already, without doing any work, there was no requirement from a compliance point of view within the network to see any wet signatures whatsoever. There was a reasonable usage of things like DocuSign where people wanted to use it. Not everybody uses these sorts of things anyway, but there's no requirement there in the first place. We just weren't really making a big deal about it. We converted all of the AR contracts and things like that to using DocuSign for it as well. The one thing that we couldn't get signed is where there's things like personal guarantees and anything that needs to be witnessed and stuff like that. So in the article, I kind of discussed why that's a peculiar issue around digital signatures. It technically can be done digitally, but the person that's witnessing it has to be stood next to you and sign it digitally, which kind of destroys the entire point of doing it in the first place. So you can do it, but it's largely a complete waste of time. So from a regulatory perspective, and this is the kind of thing with the FCA. I mean, the statement was kind of almost that they said recently was, "Please leave us alone." It's a legal point. We're not getting in the way of it, and that's always been my understanding of it as well. From a legal perspective, there's very little that actually needs to be signed in the first place, and there's very little requirements around any of these sorts of things as to how you would do it, with the exception of a small number of documents like wills and things that need to be registered at the land registry as well, that do need a wet signature for various historic reasons. Some of the background was me wanting to get rid of wet signatures altogether. There are a few uncomfortable truths that I came across along the way. So, for example, wet signatures, it turns out, is actually more secure than you would think. It does include. There is a requirement for someone to use their own handwriting. There's a specific pen that's used in a location at a point in time. If it's witnessed, then again, it pins down the location that's there as well. Scanned signatures themselves aren't necessarily that much. You could make a decent argument to say a scanned wet signature is less secure because it's more open to fraud. And I do think, let's be honest, at the moment, there is a huge amount of fraud going on right now. And advisors' emails get hacked a lot. Platforms report this to me sort of privately and say, we do get bombarded with a lot of fraudulent applications. Some of them are via advisor email addresses and the like. And advisors, I mean, I'm sure you get them, Rich, particularly around withdrawals, fake requests for money and all those sorts of things come through all the time. So we have to accept the fact that there is a security risk around it, particularly around withdrawals. And I suspect that withdrawals are some of the things that are where a lot of the wet signatures by those platforms that are sort of digital elsewhere are still asking for an extra level of security around it. So my own preference is to try and move the industry on with regards to digital signatures as opposed to scanned versions of electronic ones, because I think that they're a better experience for everybody all around anyway. And for me, the blockages in there is really understanding from everybody as to what the difference is between an electronic and scanned signature, a digital signature and a scanned signature, and also getting providers and platforms comfortable along with advisors with what the level of encryption is, how comfortable they are with the fact that it's been signed, and also giving them some assistance with support around the security side of it as well. So with a digital signature, like DocuSign seems to be the most commonly used one that I come across, and I think it's just the biggest one, the most established out there. It's also one of the most expensive, so I suspect it will be challenged quite a bit over future years. When a contract is signed using DocuSign, it's a string of data that's created, and there's a public and a private key. One party has the public key and one party has a private key. It's almost like a lock and a key that the advisor and his client will have the signature of. The problem with that is that the platform doesn't have the benefit of some of that, of the decryption code to be able to look at the document and say, that's been validly signed. Now, I do think that we'll get to a point at some point in time where some of the platforms, and some of them like Ad Alpha, for example, are looking to try and roll out a solution where you're actually getting the client to sign things and to commit stuff on the platform itself, which is a great idea in some respects. That one of the concerns I've got with some of the platforms taking control and ownership over that is that you're effectively binding your clients and your system and your services to the platform, because you've then lost control over that contract. You know, with DocuSign, the client signs your agreements, they sign your forms, you've got a copy of that, and you can keep that regardless of what platform that you're using. If it's the platform that took ownership of it, it would take advisors out of the look, and it's a great short-term solution in a way to this particular problem. But it's another reason that when you want to shift platforms at some point in time, you're going to struggle to do it. It feels slightly like a step back towards the law of agency, which we're trying to move slowly away from. I don't think we have successfully done that so far. So for me, it needs a little bit more thought around, one, how do we move from scanned signatures to digital signatures to develop a proper solution? And two, how do we develop something that doesn't mean that either just the advisor or just the platform has the benefit of the security that goes around it? Everyone can somehow benefit from it, and it doesn't reduce the portability of the client, so you can't shift them from one platform to another, or create a bias for the advisor where he says, well, I know I'd move into this platform, but it's yet another reason why there's another bunch of contracts I'm going to have to download, or it's difficult for me to do it, or whatever along the way. So for me, I'm very pro digital signatures, and I think we need to head in that direction. But I think we have to acknowledge that, try and get a bit more detail around what the barriers are. I'm not sure everybody in the industry in various parts of it has really thought all of these problems through properly and come up with a solution that works for everybody, rather than just stopgap solutions, which is where we've landed at the moment. You know, we've moved things on a little bit, and there's a recognition that this is a problem that we need to resolve properly, not just once lockdown has disappeared. But it's a little bit more complicated when it comes to platforms and providers. At Sense, we were able to deal with it instantly. In fact, it had already really been dealt with. We just hadn't really thought about it, because there's a relationship with us as the principal of the firm and the advisors that work within the AR network anyway, and their clients and everything. We've got ownership and a line of sight of all the security of everything that's going on there, and we could get all the comfort that we needed, that digital signatures were fine for everything on it. So I think that's where we need to get to with platforms and providers as well.
Thanks, Phil. And I think that issue of fraud is a really big one. And one of the platforms that we talked to in preparing the analysis gave an example of where they were taking a scan. They took the instruction they were taking instructions by email through a scanned form, and it was an instruction for withdrawal. And they called the advisor to check, because it had been received from the client, passed on to the platform. And they called to check, and the advisor said, yeah, I got it from the client. It's absolutely fine. And they said, well, can you just double check it? And I think this, you know, we all want to move to a frictionless process, but then at the same time, sometimes having a little bit of friction in the process isn't a bad thing and can have a good outcome. It just has to be at the right points. So I'm going to ask a question that came from a listener, and I was going to ask Rich and Phil both to answer, because Rich, I know you had a comment about digital signatures too. So the question that was put through is, if we're talking proof of identity of the person making a request, will the signature in any form ever guarantee that is the person who has signed a request? Have clients looked into the work Tizer were doing with digital IDs? Where's the investor identity? Can be verified through certain gateways, Experian, Post Office, etc. And I think, Rich, that was one of the questions you had when Phil was talking, was about it's not that hard to forge digital signature. But let me pass to you.
Yeah, it's just around the fact that, you know, fundamentally anyone with one of these can forge my signature on a piece of paper. With digital signatures through many of sort of the approved and known systems that are out there, someone would need access securely to my laptop, accessing that facility from my IP address in order to fraud, try and commit fraud. So I just find it crazy that in the modern era, everyone's insisting on this. Yet I can book a room, I can access my bank account, buy life assurance, and do everything my thumbprint. So it's just financial services feels like it's being left behind significantly. And I'm not quite sure if the issue is technology or compliance departments that don't understand the law or cost, or a mixture of all the above.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you with a but on the end of it. So compliance department, I don't see any specific reason for it. I think that the issue for me on what you've just said is, and because the banking analogy is a good one. So the interaction, where the problem comes, in my opinion, around digital signatures, because I agree, digital signatures are far more secure when they're done properly. The problem as I see it is that if you open a bank account, for example, the relationship is between yourself and the bank, and that's where all the encryption and where all the security takes place. If you're dealing, so the relationship with you and your clients, you've got all of that in place, and the digital signature is far more secure than a wet signature, I would say as well. The problem comes that when you're then passing that information on to a product provider, you're basically saying, I've got all of this in place, but the provider or the platform has got that. All they're getting basically is if you print off a scanned thing saying I've got it, it's not really any different in some respects from a scanned wet signature. You know, they're not getting the benefit of all that point-to-point encryption because it goes from you to the client. They're a third party where all that you're able to do in some respects is to say to them, I've actually got that and it's secure and it's been done. They don't necessarily know that, if you get what I'm saying.
Yeah, I do understand that. Although that said, there are at least 2 platforms out there that don't want to see that stuff anyway. That they'll pretty much say you're the financial advisor. You're submitting everything through the platform. You're a regulated firm and will accept instructions securely without having to see or that you've done any of that stuff in the first place.
So and that's what they've got to do is it all comes down to their ability to take a view on it and to trust what third party's done. So if they're prepared, if they're happy to say, actually we're prepared to take somebody else's word from it and take the risks that come with it or whatever, I think that's fine. It's just they've all got slightly different approaches to it, different risk appetites, potentially the size of the firms as well. The bigger firms may be getting huge volumes of and experience lots more fraud off the back of it as well. So they'll all have just different risk appetites. I mean, a signature in many respects is about, for me, it's all about evidential weight, what it comes down to. So I have signed stuff I've witnessed stuff for people which has been completely wrong, but neither the other party, myself, or the solicitor that's been involved in it has bothered, because it's been a tick box exercise that needs to be done, and we know that this contract is never going to be challenged ever, and everyone's gone, let's not worry about it. If you think about a will as an example, if you've got a lawyer that's drafted a will for somebody, the whole reason why a lawyer's involved in it really is because they know that this is open to challenge. So they're going to go belts and braces on these sorts of things. So I think that's the kind of quandary really for some of those platforms, where they're saying, fundamentally, do we trust advisors enough when they say that we're doing it? I mean, we can dance around the handbags as much as possible, but typically I find that if it's a lawyer, they'll go, you're telling us that this has been signed, that's fine, because that's your job to do it. I mean, there are certain things that lawyers have in place, like they'll have a client account where the money will land and things like that as well. If it's a financial advisor, I just don't think financial advisors are given the same credibility. And I think this is a temporary COVID. We're going to have to do that. And I think this is just something that it just needs resolving and bottoming out one way or the other. They could audit your processes and come and look at it and say, how do we get comfortable with it? But again, most of the bigger ones don't want to do that, and you probably don't want them doing that either. If you're in a network, for example, you can go and, you're doing audits on firms anyway. So you can go, network, come and check and say, right, is the AR, they're using digital signatures, we're doing an audit anyway, we'll just check that they're doing it properly and all that sort of stuff for it. So you can do that. You've got the infrastructure to be able to do it. You just don't if you're a big platform with a huge number of users. So they'll always take a bit of a view on it, I think.
I think that leads on nicely to a question that Andre Costa had about whether this will persist, and this was asked by somebody else as well. Andrew, I'm just going to unmute you.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, perfect. So my question is actually if you think that the platforms will revert to eSignatures when all of this situation is resolved in a way. Because for what I see, some platforms are just looking for quick solutions right now, and they may not be like the best solutions. So do you think they will revert to eSignatures?
Great. I think it's a really good question, and one that's come up quite a bit, actually. I mean, it's hard to know, right? It's hypothetical. Will they go back? Will they not? A lot of them are saying, don't take this as being a permanent state, that we're responding to an emergency. But my view is that measures that are introduced in periods such as the one that we're in rarely get taken away afterwards. There was a really good piece, I don't know if you saw it in the FT, by Yuval Noah Harari, where he talks about a lot of the security measures that are being brought in, and changes to views on data protection, and his article was sort of cautioning that you have to be careful what powers you give the state and businesses in times like this, because rarely will those be retrenched afterwards. E-signatures and digital forms is not quite as important as surveillance, but I think the same principle applies. So my view, and it's a view, because it's impossible to predict the future, is that these things will remain. Rich, Phil, I don't know if you want to add anything. Hannah?
It will remain to be seen, I think. I think a lot of what we're seeing from platforms and even our own network seem to be suggesting that any temporary measures are exactly that. They're temporary, which might mean that they'll revert or be reviewed during the process, but remains to be seen.
I guess they'll probably have a look and see what the business levels are, how it's been impacted. I think one of the issues that disadvantages Rich and a lot of the younger planners and the new startup businesses out there is that the amount of signatures and paperwork and all the rest of it is very pronounced for a relatively young new business that's either bringing clients across from old firms or brand new clients that signing up as well. And as a result of that, a lot of platforms out there will look at businesses like that and say, well, they're just small businesses. They've not got that much in AUM, which is all that they're kind of looking at, because they're just starting out. Now, in 5 years' time, there'll be a big business. You'll have all the clients that you need, and you won't have quite the same demand for the same problem around signatures. So a lot of the very big, very established businesses out there don't seem to have the same problems, because they're just sat on a bunch of clients and don't have the same volume of paperwork and stuff, business to write, if you like. So I do think that their perception of the world and how important things are is slightly skewed by looking at big established businesses and not thinking about who are the businesses of the future, if you like, that need this sort of stuff.
I was muted. Alan Easter, I'm going to come to you next. Alan has a question. I'm stalling for time, so he finds his unmute button. Alan had a question about why the different practices across different firms. Alan.
It wasn't the firms. It was those charts earlier that Hannah was showing around the platforms and the processes, and there were. It seemed to me that there was such a delta between those who do and those who don't, that it seemed to me that maybe not all of that was systems ability, maybe some of that was interpretation of rules. And then that follows on to Phil's really interesting insight into things like lawyers and who approaches things. And we all know that CF10s tend to interpret in very different ways the same set of documentation. So I was just keen to understand whether or not what the panel felt, how much of that would be interpretation of rules and how much of that would just be sheer inability to offer the service.
Before I go to the panelists to answer, I just want to add another question that Gary Hale asked through the Q&A about letters of authority for new clients. So he says that he thinks we'll sort out e-signatures for new business and servicing in due course. What about letters of authority for new clients? So if you can address sort of both questions in your response, which they vaguely relate, Alan, I hope you agree.
Indeed.
Anyone want to take that, or do you want? I mean, I can start. We talk to the platforms about this, and it is interpretation, and it's also mobilizing people to make a decision. And the thing that's changed at the moment is that, you know, one platform that we talked to said that they would have had to form a committee that would have concluded people from all sorts of different departments, and they would have, you know, it would have taken weeks to get a meeting of that committee. Phil's sighing. It's like, oh God, right? But this is the reality of the way these firms operate and have to operate in some cases. But with everybody suddenly working from home and operating in a crisis situation, you were able to suddenly get all of the people who needed to be involved in that decision together in a virtual call like this one, and they could thrash it out, figure out what had to be done, and they didn't have to meet 2 weeks later and figure out that 3 of the people hadn't done what they said they were going to do and wait another 3 weeks to meet. And so people were able to move quite quickly. But what one of the platforms we spoke to also told us was that they realized that they couldn't move as far as they hoped they could. They had hoped that they could move to digital processes, but actually that required a lot more work from tech, from compliance, from operations. And so they took scanned forms as an interim measure, but they're now working on removing some of those forms and moving to digital processes. So in answer to your question, it is about different interpretation. It's about different legacy bits brought together. It's about working with third-party partners. So sometimes you have different rules for transfers, and sometimes that's meant that the processes for dealing with transfers have then been applied to other processes. On letters of authority, I think that's a really interesting question. And I know that, you know, NS and I have done some work to get a letter of authority, but I think it's still a paper version. And so it's something that's done infrequently. But Phil, Rich, do you have anything to add to Alan's point or Gary's?
I was going to say, I think that there are some letters of authority that can be done on an Origo service, which is done digitally. I'm not sure it's as comprehensive as everyone would like it to be, but it's perfectly doable. The other, I agree with you in terms of it's down to interpretation. I mean, the system side of it it's a cost benefit analysis. So there's politics, there's sales that goes into it. You know, someone's looking at it going, right, it's going to cost us X amount of money to do this. Who are the people that are screaming for it? And the sense of it is the people that are screaming for digital signatures are people where they're going, well, they're not our biggest customers it stands right now, because the biggest customers are more established firms that sat on a big pot of £400 million worth of client money or whatever. And they just haven't got to that point yet where it's been pressing enough for them to spend however much money it takes to get there on it. And the reality is that the newer platforms that are coming out now will have all of this functionality, I think, built into it, and people will start to feel new businesses vulnerable, and then all of a sudden it will free all these things up for it. So I think it's an interpretation. It's easy to blame the compliance people and all the rest of it, but none of this is insurmountable. It just comes down to the fact that someone's got to make a decision. But it's pretty pathetic in it saying, but would have to form a committee and would have to, I mean, like these organisations don't have millions of meetings in the first place over God knows what. It's a bit like saying, well, we could do it, but we're just so incompetent.
We did have
we'd all bang into each other and fall over and stuff like that. We wouldn't be able to get through the door at the same time. It's terrible.
We did have a platform tell us that they got a quote for the cost of moving processes digital, and it was in the millions of pounds.
Yeah, I can imagine that for some of them, but yeah.
So a big consideration. Rich.
I was going to say, I think what we see on boots on the ground is, from letter of authority perspective, is that some companies have got better at it. Platforms seem to have got a bit better as far as some of them accepting scanned versions of that, but generally, I think the process has got worse. It's gone backwards. I mean, I could think of 3-4 years ago, you send a letter of authority with a scanned signature, an original wet signature, and the provider will come back and say, here's act upon it, and say, here's the information. In the last, I think, 3 years, it's got worse. So providers now want 3 or 4 bits of key identifiable information on one piece of paper. Now, not to mention the security risk involved in putting on one piece of paper someone's address, national insurance number, date of birth, along with their signature. Those are the modern day demands of most life assurance companies and providers at the moment. And a lot of them, including this, the zombie, related to what Phil said, a lot of the zombie providers who aren't actually open for new business, what incentive have they got for getting any better? A lot of them are getting worse. I mean, a provider that recently unloaded a lot of their back book to Phoenix, that used to act on letters of authority in 3 to 5 working days, and now looking at it in 10 working days. So it's going the other way, getting a lot worse, in our opinion.
Yeah, and so you've got some agreement in the chat room, which I don't know if you've seen, and we were asked if we could extend our review to cover some of those pension providers, but they're just not as forthcoming as the platforms. I'm sure you won't be surprised to know. We've got one last question in the Q&A that I'm going to put to Rich to wrap up. Is there any reluctance from advisors or clients, in your view, of adoption of digital signatures and e-forms and so on?
We don't really see that. We're starting to see more clients that are sending us documents that are signed digitally or electronically, and we have to kind of then go back apologetically and apologize on behalf of the industry that we can't actually access that, and I have to put a 76p, I think they're our first class stamp on it, and send it in the post, or via carrier pigeon or something like that. I think it's just, I don't think there's any barrier there. I still think there is probably a valid argument for some clients that will want to see paperwork and sign paperwork, and they're the same clients that probably won't embrace a client portal or want to download or upload documents to a client portal. But I think that's a shrinking minority in our view. I think once people understand how efficient they can be, not to mention the benefits as far as ethically, in terms of not printing out half a rainforest of paper and sending it via the post. I think people kind of get it, and they're keen to embrace it and work smarter with it. So I don't think there's really a barrier or an issue there, provided people understand it. I mean, you walk past the Apple store, and half the people being set up on their new iPad are well over the age of 65. So I don't think it's a myth that the baby boomer generation are just not interested in being efficient or using online services.
And what about planners? Do you think there's any inertia on the part of the planners to not pushing for this or not adopting?
I think it depends on the planner and the firm, really. I think if you're kind of entrenched in processes where you're signing forms and printing application forms, and that's the way you work, and you don't really want to innovate or be more efficient, then there are people like that. I mean, many in sort of the community, the next gen planners community, is, there's people banging the drum daily basis and effing and jeffing about providers not accepting this, that, and the other. So it's I think there's an army of people coming over the hill that this is just frankly not acceptable anymore.
Oh, great. I agree. I agree. We're going to wrap up there. I know there's been more questions that we haven't been able to address, but but I want to make sure our committee meeting ends on time. We're planning to make a recording available, but we'll listen back and decide whether we like it. And so if you want to share it with anyone else, let us know. We can provide that to you. Coming up next for us, we're doing a report on, we're calling it Cashman. It's cash management. So if that's something you're interested in, we're going to have a webinar probably in a couple of weeks on that. If you do want to give your platform 5 stars or fewer, go to the NextWealth directory and put in a review. We'd love to see that. Thanks to Rich, Phil, Hannah for joining us. Thanks to all the questions, participants, and have a good rest of the day. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.